Hello everyone, welcome to my stories. This is the first installment to a story I've been promising almost since day one, Alpha, Unity Wars. This is the backstory to Space Station Alpha. Also know there are no spoilers, Space Station Alpha will continue after I release Sanctuary 04. I hope you enjoy, Alpha, Unity Wars.
The doors open, an elderly man walks into the room. As he walks to the couch, a young reporter stands up and speaks. My Lord Dawn, my name is Jacob Wynne. I'd like to interview you for my new book I'm writing. It's a historical view of the Unification War. Dawn sits in his chair and puts down his coffee. What would you like to know, young man? The Imperial Library should have all the information you require. Wynne smiles. Yes, sir, there is plenty of data in the records, but no first-hand reports. I want to know your perspective, your view as to what happened. Dawn sips his coffee. First-hand report I guess it wouldn't hurt. With Arcturus's passing and the successful ascension of his son, it may be time to tell the story. I'll tell you what I know, but it's not a very long story. You may want to add information from the Imperial Library to fatten your book. Wynne sits down on the edge of the couch. I will take whatever you can give me. Well, let's see. Let's begin before the war. I was a young cadet at West Point. I was in my last year, preparing to be a second lieutenant in the United States Army. It was a week out of graduation and all my classes had been completed. I was second in the class and the instructors felt I could become a valued member of the Army's top brass one day. At the time, I felt I was ready for anything and was proud to be a member of the US Army. A group of my friends were planning a night out and had, somehow, talked me into joining them. There was a world war going on in the Middle East and most of the political ties that had been brokered by the government had been cut. We were not expecting to see each other again and felt each of us would be dead within a year. I was the only hopeful one in the bunch, and at the bar I tried several times to convince this sad group of 22-year-olds that the future was bright. I remember clearly the argument I had with Dennis. He wouldn't listen to reason. Dennis looks up at Taylor, smiles and says, I'm glad you think everything is going to be okay, Taylor, but I can't shake this feeling that the war will get worse. I don't know how, but I feel that the end is near, and this war will be it. Taylor shakes his head. The United States will make it through this war just like it has with every other war we've fought. I can't believe our generals wouldn't be able to win this one. Dennis shakes his head. Taylor, the eternal optimist, we will see. I didn't know it then, but Dennis was right. The war was going bad and soon it would turn to the worst. A week later we had graduated and received our orders. I was ordered to a base in Virginia to receive my service training. I would command a small armored platoon that was to be sent to Syria to help hold the line against the enemy forces. Training would take 2 months and I was eager to get to the battlefield. 2 weeks into training we discovered how bad the war was really going. Russia, China, North Korea and a few other smaller countries launched a nuclear solution to end the war that was about to be lost. The United States were prepared for such an event and many of the missiles were destroyed in the upper atmosphere. But what wasn't expected was the nuclear bomb that somehow had been planted under Washington, D.C. It was set off first before the missiles were launched. I remember the report came in about 1 hour before the missiles hit. The base was evacuated as it was a possible target, and myself and my platoon headed inland to a small mountainous region of Virginia that had no military or political bearing. We waited there for at least a month, for a communication to tell us to return to the base, or any base. One morning my sergeant came to me and she was worried. Sir, the men are anxious, they believe the government has fallen, and are wanting to return home to check on the families. I see, let me speak with them. An hour later I stood in front of the men who were waiting for some good news. Platoon, I am willing to approve your return to families on the assurance that in 1 month's time you will return here. I will stay and keep an ear to the radio for any instruction we may receive during that time. Is this fair to you? The whole platoon erupted in cheers. The men one by one slowly left. Over the course of 2 days, 5 members of my division stayed to assist me: Sergeant Elizabeth Ward, Michael Dean, Dylan Johnson, Darrell Moore, and Philip Gordon. We spent the month in relative peace doing upkeep on the tanks and, to be honest, living. There was a conversation between me and Philip about the tanks. Sir, Philip grunted, I still don't understand why our tanks still work. It's just, don't those EMP things mess with electrical equipment? Well, Phil, I was worried about that and was expecting to have to figure out a workaround, but it seems we are far enough from a nuke that it didn't affect us. Elizabeth pipes in other words, Phil, we got lucky. I looked at Elizabeth. So Sarge, where are you from? Why did you choose to stay behind with us? Elizabeth gets a sad smile on her face. I'm from DC. All my family was there. So I had no one to go to. We stood there for a moment in shock. Then I walked up to Elizabeth and said, I know this is highly inappropriate. I gave her a hug. Elizabeth sank into my arms and started to cry. The rest of the men cleared the room as I held Elizabeth, practically keeping her from hitting the floor. I managed to get her back to her tent and just held her for the rest of the day. She finally passed out from crying. I came out of the tent and closed it behind me. Daryl walked up. Sir, it wasn't your fault she was going to go through this. She has been holding this in. Over the next week, me and Elizabeth planned and worked on the vehicles. We became more and more close. Eventually she came to my tent one night and, well, that's private. I'm sure Elizabeth would kill me if I continued. I still believe that if the nukes hadn't dropped, our love would never have happened. Let's just say there was more than one occasion we shared a cot. The month came to an end. One by one the men returned, about 80% of the division. Of those who returned, many wished they hadn't gone. There were massive losses, and with the destruction of DC, many of the states were now under military dictatorships. Generals had arrested politicians who refused to stay in the Union, and at least 3 states, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, were in full revolt against the generals. I personally didn't agree with the actions of the generals and asked if there was one state that was likely to win. The answer was Texas, so after a month of planning, the tanks were ready and we had collected Texas flags. We took the 3-day trip we planned to get to Texas. During that time, we flew Union flags to hide our intentions. We arrived at the front line of the revolt, old World War II-style tanks on the Union side. EMP must have done a number on the Union vehicles. There were modified police vehicles, and what appeared to be World War II tanks on the Texas side. There was also no air support for either side. We knew just what to do. Scanning the radio, we found the frequency the Texans were using, and we relayed our intent to join them. The general in command, General Thomas Dickinson, agreed to us joining the battle and gave us orders. We were to flank the Union tank command, in the hopes of ending this battle. I gave the order to charge and we rolled out, all waving the Union flags as part of the plan. Guns blazing and full speed, we managed to take out 2 tank platoons before we reached the command and took it over. At that point we gave the order to surrender, and the remaining 6 platoons stopped firing and came out of their tanks with hands up. We contacted General Dickinson and informed him of the surrender. His men came over the line and arrested the tank crews. General Dickinson himself found me and my men. He congratulated us on a success. I asked about air support and he told me the EMP had fried most of the electronics. No computers, no internet, no refineries. They had a few generators and were working on setting up wind turbines to power lighting, but that was it. He requested my presence when he met with his general, 3-star General Morgan Wright, for his weekly debriefing. One day later, we arrive at the Military Command Building in Fort Worth, the new capital after the nuclear strike on Austin. We walked into the building and up the main staircase. Walking through the halls, General Dickinson informed me of General Wright's personality. Remember, he is by the book, so don't speak unless you're spoken to. He will acknowledge your presence, ask for my report, and then consider speaking to you. I responded with a yes sir and continued walking down the hall. We arrived at General Wright's office and entered. General Wright was a massive human, hands the size of catcher's mitts and a forehead that looked more reminiscent of a caveman than human. Also, being 6'7" didn't help. Looking up from a report, his piercing white eyes startled me at first. It was unexpected, of course. So this is the tank platoon leader that saved the day, Lieutenant Dawn, Sir Taylor Dawn. General Dickinson introduces me to General Wright. Then gives his report on the war at the front. After an hour of statistics and troop movements, that's about all of it, sir. Oh sir, is there any news on when we can expect some air support on the front? General Wright leans back. There won't be any. The repair crew can't get the blasted things to run. Too many electronic devices. It all got fried by the nukes EMP. Dickinson shakes his head. We could have used them. Well, Lieutenant, General Wright cradles his fingers. We are glad to have you. I managed to get some information on you, fresh out of West Point, second in your class, little to no experience on the field, yet you still have the loyalty of your crews. I'm impressed. After what has happened, I would have expected your crews to go AWOL. How did you do it? I took a moment to think, sir. I let them go home with the agreement to return after a month. I did lose about 20% of my crews in this, but it hasn't affected our ability to fight. It also gave me some much needed perspective and intel. General Wright starts to laugh. I like you, Dawn. That was pure genius. Give the men what they want and get the intel you needed. Simple but effective. Well done, and because of you we have our first major victory against the Union Army. General Dickinson, give this man a promotion from lieutenant to captain. We need more like him. Dickinson says yes, General. General Wright stands up and adjusts his jacket. Now, Captain, if you would excuse us, me and General Dickinson have a meeting with the rest of the top brass. You can wait in the arrivals room downstairs. I salute. Yes, sir. I left the room and went downstairs. There I found a series of tables and enjoyed a coffee and cake. I hadn't seen cake in months. Wow, that cake was good. Or maybe I just really wanted something sweet. It was just that long. After an hour, General Dickinson found me waiting and we returned to his temporary apartments across the street. He then brought me into his office. Taylor, he said, I need to tell someone, so I hope I can hold you in my confidence. I nodded. Yes, sir, I can keep my mouth shut. Good, Taylor. Taylor, you seem to have chosen the right timing to arrive at the front. Many of the governing Union generals are arguing over who should be in charge. It seems the Union is about to collapse into military dictatorships. Arizona and New Mexico are on the verge of backing out of an agreement to join Texas as allies. We will be on our own, but also have no real enemies around us. If everything goes as predicted, their arguing generals will do a job for us within 2 to 3 years. I looked at my general, sir, who oversees Texas. Dickinson smiles. For now. Until elections can be set up. General Wright. I nodded. Yes, sir. Taylor, you're coming with me and your company, as a security detachment, to the New Mexican border, to have a meeting with the leadership of New Mexico and Arizona's military. We will try again to ensure the cooperation and alliance. Understood, sir. You'll be my security chief. 2 days pass with my company moving to the border and nightly meetings with my general. It's been busy. As we arrive, we can see 2 platoons of troops surrounding the encampment. Myself and General Dickinson walk into the camp, making a way to the tent with the other representatives. 3 hours of squabbling later and the leadership is still at an impasse. General Pelton looks at General Dickinson. Well, looks like you won't agree on anything, so. Guards. 12 men rush the tent, guns pointed at the ready. You'll be our guests until General Wright arrives to negotiate with us personally. Take them away. A few moments later, a messenger arrives at the division, with a note appearing to be from General Dickinson. It states that him and Captain Dawn will be staying in the camp for a while and they are to await further orders. Time passes, and we find Sergeant Ward in her tent, awaiting orders. I can't believe we haven't heard from them in weeks. Michael speaks. The note did say to await further orders. I'm sure they're okay. Dylan says, Sarge, let me go into the camp with Michael. We'll find out what's going on. Elizabeth, do it. I'm tired of waiting, and keep this between us. If nothing is wrong, I don't want this getting to the general. Michael and Dylan, yes ma'am. The two disappear into the night and soon find themselves moving through the camp. One by one they covertly check the tents until they come on a highly guarded tent with noises coming from it. They find a flap in the back of the tent and can lift it slightly. They see Dawn chained to a pole with no shirt and lash marks on his back, bleeding badly. They then see a man hitting General Dickinson across the face and his eyeball flies across the room. Both men in shock realize they currently can't help and make the way back to inform Elizabeth. As they disappear back into the night, a camp guard spots them and runs to tell General Pelton. The pair arrive at Elizabeth's tent telling what they found. Elizabeth rushes out the tent to rouse the company. As the company readies the tanks, 30 men arrive at their encampment to arrest the company. The leader of the men steps forward. You are all under arrest, come along peaceably. Elizabeth gets an evil grin. I would love to oblige, except you have chosen the wrong entry point to the camp. Look up. The leader of the enemy looks at the tank in front of him and sees what looks like a square dish pointing at them. At that moment it is turned on by Michael, the sound waves are set to make the men physically ill and all 30 of the enemy men collapse to the ground unable to move, let alone hold the guns. Elizabeth orders the company to disarm and tie up the men as they finish up the readying of the tanks. General Pelton enters the tent with Taylor and Dickinson. Well, it seems your sergeant got suspicious and sent some spies into my camp. It's okay, I sent 30 men to the camp to resolve the issue. Taylor starts to laugh. General Pelton says, "Why are you laughing?" Taylor turns his head, "Because I feel tanks coming." The general's eyes widen just as explosions start to shake the camp. The tanks charge into the camp, firing the sonic weapons into the crowds of troops as they pass by, rolling over tents, eventually making to the tent where Taylor and Dickinson are. The sonic weapons pan the area, debilitating all the soldiers in the camp as Elizabeth, Michael and Daryl charge into the tent, shooting the guards and rifle butt hitting the general in the face, knocking him out. Elizabeth ran to me, while Daryl and Michael helped General Dickinson. She untied me and looked at me. "You'll be okay, we're here, lay down, let's look at your back." Some of the flesh was gone and Elizabeth called for a medic. They spent the next hour patching myself and General Dickinson up. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had the company tie up the remaining soldiers in the camp and General Pelton, who woke up about the time the medics were finished with me and General Dickinson. General Pelton, now on his knees, has a gun pointed at his head by General Dickinson. "Well, how the tables have turned. What do you have to say for yourself now, General?" General Pelton looks up. "Wright asked us to take you in and kill you. He won't allow an election. He is getting rid of the generals who won't follow him as a dictator. This was part of the deal we made to join Texas as a full member, making Arizona and New Mexico Texas." General Dickinson's eye turns red. He pulls the trigger, shooting the general in the same eye he lost. "We will see. Ready the tanks, we return to Fort Worth." Taylor looks at Dickinson. "What about these men?" Dickinson looks at them, saying, "Who wants to join me?" About half the men stand up. "Untie them, the others, leave them to die of starvation." The company make the way to Fort Worth over the course of 5 days, picking up more troops and meeting up with companies loyal to Dickinson. As they arrive at Fort Worth, they see that news has reached Wright, who sends a messenger to Dickinson. The message was simple: "I see you found out, let's see if you can take out this dictator." Dickinson looks at the messenger. "Bad day for you, son." In General Wright's office a package arrives. As Wright's men open the package, in front of the general, they drop it and jump back. The head and hands of the messenger fall out of the box at Wright's feet. Wright picks up a hand that has a note tied to it. The note reads, "No dictators in Texas." At that moment, shells from the tanks start raining down on the command building. After constant bombardment for about an hour, it's turned into rubble. The tank divisions move through the city streets with Taylor's company at the lead. They make the way to the command building and they find General Wright still holding the note on the ground, skull crushed from a fall. A bystander tells them he jumped from the building when the shelling started. Lord Dorn sits back and sips his coffee again. General Dickinson became the leader of the Free Army and became the temporary leader of Texas until an election occurred a year later. As for Arizona and New Mexico, they still joined Texas, but the generals who had planned Dickinson's demise were allowed to leave the military. The world had changed, and not for the good. The intel was correct. The dictator generals in the Union started fighting among themselves and we started to get refugees into Texas. 4 years later, we were contacted by several native tribes, all from the Midwest, and all wanted to join Texas as states. This is what happened to Arizona and New Mexico. We were also contacted by most of the Midwest. It seems after our victory against the Union and General Wright, many of the new countries overthrew the dictators. They all were petitioning to become states. At the time the new government had no negotiators, so General Dickinson sent me and Lieutenant Elizabeth Ward to negotiate with the different groups. It was decided to set the meeting at the Hopi Cultural Center in the Hopi Reservation. It was simply a peaceful area, and the United Native Tribes were one of the first to petition for statehood. We were welcomed as brothers by the representatives for the UNT and spoke at length with them as to plans to the future of the country we were trying to create. The tribes laid claim to almost a quarter of Arizona. They also claimed Colorado, southern Utah and Nevada. They stated that northern Utah belonged to the Mormons and they had already made a deal with them. One by one the representatives arrived till there was 6 groups. The UNT, Montana, Utah, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Iowa. All had about 5 persons in each. There was only one representative per group. The rep for Montana was Sharon Smith, for Iowa was James Gardner, for Kansas was Justin Dale, for Utah Ellen Stone, and for Oklahoma was Jill Witt. After introductions we retreated to our rooms and prepared for the beginning of negotiations in the morning. I remember walking into the Hopi Cultural Center meeting hall, which had been turned into a kind of congressional chamber. I asked the UNT rep where we would be sitting. I wasn't thinking. He pointed at the table at the head of the room in front of the others. As my team got settled in, we started to look over the proposals. Elizabeth points to a line in the proposal by Kansas. They are laying claim to Colorado. The UNT has already laid claim to it. I shook my head. Well, they better have a good reason. The meeting started and one by one the groups put out the proposals, starting with the United Native Tribes. Finally we came to Kansas and Rep. Dale stood. Honored guests and representatives, Mr. Speaker, I stand before you to issue our proposal for statehood in the Texas National Conference. First, it has come to our attention that the proposal from the United Tribes has claimed part of our land. The land that we freed from General Oswald Morlean. We request they relinquish their claim on this land. I stood up and looked at the representative from the UNT. Would the honorable representative from United Native Tribes like to answer this statement? Representative Lighthorse stood and said, no. The land is ours. We earned it by taking the state a year ago from General Oswald Morlean after he tried to invade our tribal land. I turned to Rep. Dale. Sir, I believe that the United Native Tribes have a legal right to that land in Colorado. Would you be willing to maybe divide the land equally, as it seems you both claim this land? We will not. Dale starts to become angry. The people of Colorado are represented here, and they lay claim to this land and ask me and my team to represent them. Representative Dale, I stood up. There is no Colorado. The state was won by the United Native Tribes and it no longer exists. Those damn red-skinned land stealers have no right to any former states. They have no right to this land. It is ours by statehood and legally they cannot have it. Unfortunately, Representative Dale, I stepped around the table to show my side arm. That's not accurate. You see, that land was taken by force in an illegal war that was not sanctioned by Congress and then turned into a state. Also, the Louisiana Purchase was not a legal purchase of land, since France had not purchased the land or won the land in a legal war. In fact, the only people that have a legitimate claim to any of the land west of the Appalachians are the Native American tribes that once lived there. Other than your claim to former statehood, which doesn't hold water here, the only other people who have a claim to the land west of the Appalachians are the Mormons. They purchased the land from the Native Americans on arriving at Salt Lake, Utah. So, Mr. Dale, if you wish to have any ground to stand on here and don't want to piss off Texas, I'd look into making a deal with the United Native Tribes. Rep. Dale stood there for a moment, sizing me up and taking everything I said into his mind. Then I said, also I would like you to show the United Native Tribes, representatives and people, the same respect that you would show me or any other representative in this room. The use of racist words or ignoring parts of a nation's official title will not be tolerated. You are currently on shaky ground and I suggest you sit down before the bull coming out of your backside makes another noise. Rep. Dale looked over at the UNT table. Representative Lighthorse, I would like to apologize to you, your team, and your nation. I was clearly wrong in my statement and ask for forgiveness that I do not deserve from your united peoples. Rep. Lighthorse was visibly in shock by this apology and walking over to Dale shook his hand and said, you have our combined forgiveness. I would respectively like to offer half the state of Colorado to you for the good work your people have accomplished in removing General Oswald Morlean from his position. Rep. Dale looked at Rep. Lighthorse. Yes, I would agree, and am honored you offered it. After everyone returned to their seats, we spent the rest of the day going over the ins and outs of the negotiations. After 1 month all the deals were struck, and the Texas National Conference was now the official governing body of the entire Midwest. Times were changing and 2 years later we received a message from California and Virginia. Both wanted to join Texas National Conference. After 4 months of negotiations with both, General Dickinson was able to bring them in. At this point there was only New York, and General Taylor Richardson. Richardson was the leader of the government takeover and was the head of the Joint Chiefs when we were still the United States. I was now the military attaché to General Dickinson and was promoted to major. Me and Elizabeth got married, and as for Elizabeth, she left the army and became a rep for Texas in the new governing council. She was also pregnant with our first child Dylan. He was stillborn. The radiation in the atmosphere was too much for him. I received the news in a meeting with General Dickinson and his top staff and rushed to her side. Elizabeth is a strong woman, Mr. Wynne. I'm not ashamed to say I cried more than she did. A month later General Dickinson received a message from General Richardson. It was a declaration of war. At this point the tanks were out of fuel and were basically unmovable artillery pieces. And we knew there was a long war against Virginia in which New York had run out of artillery. We took the guns off our tanks and mounted them to artillery stocks, so they could be moved and prepared for what we felt would be the last battle we would fight in, the battle for New York. Soon we started the march. As we reached the border we found no resistance, and in fact there had been no attack on us. General Dickinson was almost going to turn around, thinking it was a trick to get Richardson's people to support him in another failed war. But after speaking to his commanders he decided to push on. We split the army into 3 waves. One came into New York from the west, one from the south, and one would come in at a center point between the others. We would all push to the capital of New York City and take it out. One by one, city after city fell with no resistance. In fact, the people welcomed us with open arms. As we pushed further and further closer to New York, General Dickinson got more and more worried this was somehow a trick. Finally, after 3 months of marching and liberating, we arrived at the border to New York City. We continued our movement of 3 arms into the city, carefully moving block after block, making our way to the city hall where Richardson was supposed to be. After a few hours we arrived. What we found was intriguing. Richardson strung up by his own men, who were awaiting us to surrender. Haha, I bet that's the most anticlimactic war story you ever heard. His own generals strung him up. They were so scared of Dickinson they couldn't even figure out how to tell him until he got there. The next 3 months were spent reforming a government for New York and unifying it with the Texas National Conference. We now had a unified nation again, almost 8 years after the United States collapsed into anarchy. We thought it was over, at least I did. The president was grateful to General Dickinson for all the work he had done and was glad he was not in charge of the military. See, the Texas National Conference government was a council of 2 reps per state. And a rep was selected president once every 2 years. The current president had only been in charge for a year, and the military was under the command of the separated office of the commander-in-chief. Currently that office was held by General Thomas Dickinson. The president presided over the council, and the council acted as a mix between the Supreme Court and the Senate. It definitely wasn't the United States government, but it did okay at the time. Slowly we started getting reports that Canada and Mexico wanted to join our new government, and we obliged them, uniting the entire North American continent for the first time in history. And yes, the tribes had their own states. Over the next 2 years we settled in, Eric was born, and we slowly returned the national power grid back on. The country started to buzz again. We still didn't have planes, but ships and cars were now working after some basic repairs. We started hearing news of similar takeovers in other countries in South America. We sent observers to South America to determine the situation there and whether or not there was a threat. We soon learned there was plenty of threat in the nations to our south. But, Mr. Wynne, I'm tired and I need some rest. We've been at this now for 6 hours. I have business to attend to. If you want to continue this interview, see my assistant, he is in the room next door. Yes sir, Lord Dawn. Believe me when I say this has definitely been an interesting story so far. You have a good evening, sir.
Thank you for listening. As I said at the beginning, the next video is Sanctuary 04. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and remember to comment. Thank you again. Good night.